The Lottery was also, a racially charged movie, more about the education system, which is kind of on the polar opposite side of, the prison system.
Yeah, I was actually just doing an interview with Madeleine, the director, Madeleine Sackler, of both OG and Hard Truth before, and she did The Lottery, which is the film you mentioned, a documentary where I met her, and she was just saying that I think the nucleus for OG came out of working on The Lottery, where one of the storylines, it's a documentary that follows different characters in Harlem and the Bronx that are trying to get the kids into a charter school or into a school that is better than the failing local public schools. And there's a lottery that these families have to win to get the kids into school. So we followed for a few weeks, for like 6 weeks, I think. We followed different families, and one of the families had a boy whose father was in prison, and the boy didn't know his father other than going to his house, which is the prison, for the occasional visits. And I think that somehow started a nucleus for Madeleine that sort of led to this whole journey to do OG. And he was about to come out, and he was in his 50s, and her mind, she was saying today, was going through what is it like for somebody, for both the families, the relatives, to have somebody in prison who then comes out into, after like 20 years of missing this life outside, to how to function in that world. And I think that's sort of what the theme of OG became.
Sure. So, which came first, Hard Truth or OG?
The idea for OG, I think, came first for Madeleine. Like there was always going to be a documentary to be made while it's very hard to get an independent feature together anyways, and to do this in a maximum security prison, to get the permits and to find the right prison and the right people that would do it is incredibly hard. So
this is kind of unprecedented, right? Like
I think I've never seen a fiction movie shot. I mean, I've seen that there's a TV series called Lock Up where documentary crews go in, but to do actually a fiction film where some of the inmates play parts. There might have been an Italian film that was made a few years ago, but with the Taviani brothers, I think. But I was never, that was a very unique idea Madeleine had. But basically, it took many years for her to put this together, and there was an original trip that Madeleine did with the writer Steve Belber and me, and we started interviewing inmates based with this sort of nucleus of an idea that she had of a film about somebody who spends his life in prison, who's about to get out, and just terrified by this transition between the two worlds. And those interviews then formed the script that Steve Belber wrote, and the dialogue and the scenes and the drama that sort of, that slow thriller kind of element that the film has, that Steve Belber wrote. Out of this whole many hours of interviews with both guards and inmates.
So the research kind of evolved into a film of its own.
So that research then became the script, and while the script was being written, Madeleine undertook to do a documentary class in the prison, and she was interested in many aspects of the prison and prison reform and education in prison before. So that class grew out of that desire, but it also served as a way to keep the prison sort of open to our interactions. It was a long process, and once you have the okay, you have to sort of, for one, you have to make sure that it's possible, but you also have to sort of keep it going. You have to keep going every now and then, and you have to meet the pool of inmates. So she was allowed, the prison okayed certain inmates to be in the films, and couldn't just pick people. There was a pool of people given by the prison. It's a prison with 1,800 inmates, and for the documentary, she might have had a pool of 50 people who wanted to do it, and who the prison administration okayed to be in the film. And this has to do with, when there aren't, if there's any disciplinary things going on with them and so forth, so it was allowed in that. And she started teaching this class and filming it. And then shortly thereafter, she realized she was showing them films, and if you watch Hard Truth, you see it, she was showing them like, Murder Ball and Grizzly Man, they heard some films, and she showed them a sense of a whole 10 documentaries that they could watch before. She had the prison administration show it through the TV system, and then she would talk about them, and from that, teach them what these filmmakers were doing, and talk about that with them. So she was giving them interview techniques, how to get interviews, how do you address somebody this, how to show somebody in film, what is the reason to do this, So she would do these classes, film myself doing the classes. So this whole was a very organic process and unfolded into the documentary. Then she would call me, and I would go back for a few other visits in the prison to basically set up more standardized interviews where we had 2 cameras that we put in the room with the inmates. Then we'd have a monitor outside, sometimes in the prison cell, sometimes in some of the few common rooms that we're allowed to use. And we would stay outside and they would interview each other. And the 2 cameras would basically shoot the 2 angles. And those interviews and out of the group and the group discussions that we filmed sort of, sometimes with some colleagues of mine, Andrew Carter and Torsten Tito, or 2 other people who came, we got to know all the inmates and we shot scenes where they're discussing which direction the film is going. So that became part of the film as well. So it's a very meta film that grew out of the filmmaking, and then 4 storylines emerged out of that. 4 inmates' path to prison, I would say. Madeleine today called Hard Truth the prequel to OG. It's basically how these people get into prison, and OG is like what it's like after a life in prison to come out. So we would do these interviews where we'd watch outside, and it was really incredible to see what happens when you step out of the room. The amount of intimacy in the interviews and directness, especially talking about their own crimes, their path to that they took. It was pretty amazing to not ask the questions, but to actually have them ask each other the questions about how they got to where they are. And then she animated the stories, and then so that became the documentary. Between us filming these interview setups, the scenes where we film them each other, and we're a little bit in it, and we got a part of the class that she was teaching became the crew, so some of the inmates became the crew. And then Jeffrey Wright signed on to the feature. So this was happening during the year and a half that we were doing this documentary shoots that were evolving. It wasn't completely planned, but there was a documentary idea about what it would be. It wasn't clear. It became this sort of animated hybrid documentary. Jeffrey Wright signed on, and we filmed this sort of a proof of concept test where we had inmates play. We had this one inmate, Charles, played like the role that then Jeffrey would play in the cell. We had like a 10-minute script that Stephen and Madeleine had written that was very sort of calm and low level, but it was showing what we could do with a small crew. So Torsten Tilo, again, one of the cameramen that I worked with, came in with a movie, and we had like a crew of maybe 10, 12 people, and we shot this proof of concept documentary, 10-minute sort of teaser to show that this can be done. And I think it went really incredibly well and had a very intense mood, and I think it really was a great sort of roadmap to figure out how to do fiction film.
And that was pretty much essential to get in such a small crew, just because that's what the prison would allow.
Well, the crew grew. So what happens when you get the feature? Things change. The producers came on. I like working with natural light. I had a couple of old fluorescent tubes in the basement that I would stick into the prison cell because I like the old green bulbs. And other than that, I didn't really use much lights. I didn't use any lights for the test. And I didn't want to use it for the feature, but there was such an apparatus behind the feature. It was a very low indie feature, but there was the expectation that we would need it. So we ended up having a crew of 2 grips and a gaffer. I had the movie operator and my friend Torsten and an incredible focus puller. Alan was in there, and then lots of the DIT. So there was a crew of 4 people in the camera department, 3 people and it grew. So there was some people doing costume. There was a production designer who came in to move things around. So we had a crew, I think, of maybe an average of 40 people going in.
So it evolved considerably from the 2-camera setup of the interviews to
Yes.
the feature.
And end of the test. The test was a smaller crew, but what happened is the logistics of moving around in prison, actually the largest growth was, I think, in production in the AD department, just in terms of safety and how to communicate and how to move around from A to B and how to keep a whole shoot like that going.
Sure. And they would kind of shut down individual sections of the prison for you guys to shoot for a few hours, or? So
Madeleine and I spent a good part of this lead-up period to actually storyboard the film quite precisely, even though there's a lot of handheld and movie shots and so forth. We had a pretty precise idea of what the shots would be, and we knew all the locations. We had some tours of the prison, and we'd filmed them many times. So we knew there was the laundry room, there's the chow hall, there's the quad, the outside area, we knew which cells we wanted that looked the best. The prison is at maximum capacity, unfortunately, like a lot of these places are. for us to get an empty cell is really hard because we have to move somebody out of the cell and take it over. We got the cell, I think, for 2 days to shoot all of the cell footage for Jeffrey. And to move around in the prison is highly restricted, so the whole guards need to know beforehand. So we needed to make the plan way in advance of like, who are the extras? They all had to be okay, so the extras would be the inmates, but we couldn't just go and say, oh, this is great. You know, they had to be all approved from 2 levels up for the day, for the time, and there was not much flexibility.
So it might not have even been possible had you not made another movie already in the same location to help prep yourself.
Yeah, no, I think that really helped with the relationships. And there was Mo Raines, who was an incredible woman, she runs the liaison of the prison. She's she works in the guards population as part of the guards in the prison. And she was with us with the documentary, and she stayed with us through the feature. And you know, we had daily sort of briefings about security. Everything in the prison is a weapon. To bring a film crew in there is incredibly hard. It's like, imagine going through the airport, so you go through the scanner, but every piece of equipment that you have has to be scrutinized. So every pencil could be a potential weapon. Forget about screwdrivers, that's really dangerous. I mean, a piece of paper could be a weapon. So yeah, you can't bring in your cell phone, you can't bring in your money, so that, you know, some people who've been in prisons know this, but it's actually not easy to go in there. So our film gear it was a whole day of just bringing in the film gear that we used, the cameras and so forth, through the loading dock where the food comes in. Dogs went through it. Every piece had to be on a list beforehand and went through. It was a very time-consuming process, and then going in and out of prison with the whole crew every day, same thing. It took us an hour each day to get in and maybe 45 minutes to get out. And that's part of the 12-hour day we had with Sackler.
Well, I've never seen the inside of a prison look so beautiful on screen. Can you talk about how the visual style or, you know, different vantage points evolved between the documentary to the feature?
Yeah, so Madeleine, well, the script that evolved that Madeleine and Stephen, you know, Stephen wrote and Madeleine sort of envisioned and fleshed out, is a very first-person account of this man who spent his whole life in prison, Lewis, played by Jeffrey Wright. So we wanted to have a very subjective camera style. We wanted to see the whole prison from his point of view. It was important for us when he's in prison and the doors are locked, we're inside the locks with him. We don't get these beautiful shots through the gates. We have to be with him. So that dictated a lot of where the shots were taken. We storyboarded the shots a lot, and in the beginning, Madeleine surprised me that she didn't want to do much handheld, wanted to do more like very graphic shots on tripods, on a movie Steadicam, or a very sort of precise handheld and with very graphic framing. And we sort of embraced that, and we kept it very simple because we knew what we could do. We could bring in jibs or drones. Drones get shot down in prison. So it's that dictated some of the storyboarding, but the main idea was to always bring it back to get from Lewis's point of view. And at some point, that became a storyline that sort of evolved in the storyboarding and the last rewrites of the film, where there's sort of an outside world that he imagines that becomes sort of his mind flashes to another life outside that sort of opened up the film a little bit and then developed a little later. But other than that, we were always in the prison. The cameras, we didn't have like far shots of the prison from the outside. We wanted to be in the prison. Everything was from that point of view. And there's a lot of very long choreographed shots where we go with him with a movie, following him, that Tito did really beautifully at different times of day. You glide through this, it becomes a very mesmerizing experience, I think, of gliding through this prison with the point of view of being an inmate, to put the viewer really in that point of view, to really identify with the lead. And technically, the things that we ended up doing, we shot with Arri cameras. We had an Alexa Mini and an Alexa and a Mira. So a Mira and a Mini, those are two cameras that are relatively small, but that, you know, can deliver pictures that are good enough for the big screen. We wanted to shoot widescreen. We wanted to keep a little bit of a Western aspect to some of the scenes of the confrontation. And I shot a lot of the stuff handheld. Everything in the cells had to be handheld because you couldn't move any walls. There was no room to bring a tripod in, but it's very steady handheld. If you watch it, it doesn't feel very shaky. It's a very precise, again, like, you know, very graphic frames. And the lights are the practicals that we had, and we created the moods by turning some on and some off. in working with the daylight. You know, my as a cameraman, I always like to shoot into the light, so I never shoot with the light like you're doing now. It's sort of one of the rules that I basically never break. So the same thing in the prison, I would always be sitting on the john looking out against that distant daylight coming in to give them some edges. I would rarely shoot the other way. And that sort of informs a lot of the shooting. And I like the simplicity that we had to do in the prison. So I didn't use any movie lights really. We did a little bit of sometimes blacking out some fluorescents or turning them on when we couldn't turn them off, using some show cards and bounce cards, but actually very little. I always pull them back out because I always found it always too much already. Once you start in a natural light world, the few lights that you use can look incredibly wrong. So you have to be very careful. And this is the second movie that I'm using only, that I'm not using movie lights, both for day and night. So it's sort of a thing that I'm sort of starting to embrace more and more with this video cameras, because I think it just looks so good and it's so truthful. And I shot most of the movie with one lens. I mean, we had other lenses in the movie, sometimes with a different one, but I like the 40mm lens, which is a sort of a close to human perspective kind of view that has always been my favorite lens in filmmaking. This one I really went in, it's like that stayed on the camera, so I had either the handheld or the tripod version of the camera. And then the movie had sometimes a slightly wider lens, so it looks a little more steady, but also sometimes shot with that lens. We shot the whole film on one f-stop, T2.0, so we never changed the f-stop, so it's a very shallow depth of field to glide through the world with the character, to see his point of view, his focus, and a certain sense of isolation of the world around him. I think it makes sense for him to be to have that shallow depth of field, especially for those movie shots, to sort of be with him as he glides through the world. And we shot the whole film in one color temperature, which I think is unusual, so we never changed from 4,000 Kelvin, so the days get very blue and the nights get very warm. The fluorescent bulbs get quite warm and green, and we sort of like that simplicity. There's a certain honesty to just keeping things simple, one lens, one color temperature, one f-stop.
Yeah, well, I think that was all very well executed and achieved. One of my favorite parts about the film was the look and how much you feel like you're in the character's headspace, and how it's at times very claustrophobic, or other times, as you described it, mesmerizing, kind of to see his the isolation he feels even when he's surrounded by hundreds of other people. So what were maybe some of your references on this film, if any, since it's kind of a unique project?
Well, we looked at a whole bunch of films, some Alton films, but the ones that we kept coming back to was actually Children of Men, in terms of the way it looked. Shot by Shivo, Emanuel Vesky, one of my favorite films, and Madeleine's, and she pulled a lot of stills, even when we started, without me talking about that film. And that film has a very unique coloring that we sort of actually really liked, where there's a slight bluish hue in the shadows. There's a high contrast, but it's a softness of color that has a slight shift of that makes natural light look very electric, or there's something very three-dimensional about the way the colors are rendered, but it's not super colorful. So we liked that style of the film, where it makes a sort of unstaged feeling in a highly staged environment. It's a beautiful film, and I think that was the reference we used the most.
What were some of the other ways you created that unstaged feeling in the narrative after having done the documentary, since so much of the documentary story obviously influenced the second film?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of by necessity, partly. When you shoot like a big fight scene with a lot of inmates, show fighting, and some rehearsed bits and some not so rehearsed bits, you have to, there's some of that where you use your documentary instincts and you just throw the camera on the floor because there's a little light coming in there, and you just grab shots as that's happening. But most of it was actually quite choreographed and set out. So when Jeffrey's in his prison cell and he makes himself food, or he wakes up, the shots were very precise, and Jeffrey's also a very precise actor. He internalizes so much what it's like to be that inmate, that he has a routine that is very precise, the way he brushes his teeth, the way he eats his soup. And so the camera work with me sort of sitting on the john right next to him, being very close, which how we get the claustrophobic feeling, because we're in this small, 6x8 or 8x10 environment together. Becomes very precise. It's from his face, because I know he's going to do that soup. He's going to do that. He's going to fix the so there's that sort of very handheld feeling that is very precise and very meticulous almost
Yeah.
in terms of the way he acted it and the way the film had.
It definitely adds a layer of authenticity.
Yeah.
How about what kind of conversations do you have with Madeleine, especially when there isn't a project? Like, what kind of rapport do you have outside of when you're working together?
Oh, we're
Like, creatively.
Yeah. I mean, we're good friends now. This is like the fourth film, I guess, that we've worked together. I mean, Madeleine is very driven about issues. Also, she came to this originally thinking there's a huge prison population that's basically warehoused and rotting away, and whatever you think about their crimes, and this is why it was important for her to not. This is not about innocent men. It was never about innocent men. These men are guilty as charged. It's more like about the human potential and what we do with it, with these people that are in prison. I think that was an important thing. We talked about that a lot, like that there's basically no more ways to really get education in prison, and most, depending on where you are, there's very little to do. The auto body shop that's in the film is there's like, maybe 10 people working in there out of a population of 1,800. The libraries basically can't go into the library except for the only reason you can go in there and go on a computer is to go onto a closed website to study about law. I guess there's a requirement people can do it. Otherwise, it's even hard to. You can't access the internet. You can't really get books easily. I mean, everything has to almost be smuggled in as contraband, even if you wanted to educate yourself, and that is really a problem. I mean, there's so much wasted potential, and I think that really got to her when she sort of understood that. And this prison, I think, is better than others that we filmed in. But it's that's what drove a lot of our conversations. Also, her doing this documentary, she gets involved in some of these people's lives, and there's a lot of emails that she's gotten from some of them were good and some of them not so good, and to sort of we discuss that a lot and how to go forward. And there's a lot of sensitive issues.
Career advice for young and emerging artists, or maybe a piece of advice you would give to your younger self back when you were first starting out?
Related to the projects, or just in terms of how do you start in the industry, or?
Industry specific, but more specific to your journey, maybe, things you've learned that are important to you still.
Yeah, I mean, I did go to film school, but I think it's not necessary. I think the most important thing is that, once you know sort of roughly what you want to do within the industry, I mean, you can snoop around and be a PA and go into different departments if you don't know what you want to do. But if you know what you want to do with news video, you want to be in the camera department. I never liked going up the slow way, so I basically bought myself equipment and always filmed and I always stayed in. And that sort of, I basically got my first jobs because I bought the equipment that people wanted to use. So I took a big leap and bought a film camera at the time. That got me student films and other jobs to shoot. And just learn by doing, I think, was still the most important part for me, just to